Meet my starter. See the little bubbles? I fed that this morning.
What do you feed it?
50% community grains whole grain and 50% white flour. You can't really knead this dough, it's so wet. And this is a whole grain dough. So I wet my hand so it doesn't stick too much. And then essentially I turn it like this. And every fold, you see I'm stretching it, which is building strength in the gluten. But I'm also, in the folding, incorporating more air. Little air pockets that'll fill later, hopefully. And that's it. And I do that every 45 minutes. I started baking white bread, and I had as my model Chad Robertson's tartine loaf, which I think is one of the great loaves of bread. But then I started learning about some of the health issues with white flour and white bread, and realized that I didn't want to put so much effort into something that fundamentally is sugar. I mean, basically, we're mainlining glucose when we eat white flour. So I started looking at the much more complicated and difficult kind of baking that goes with using whole grains. And that's what brought me to your doorstep, because I knew you were baking with whole grain in the restaurant. One of the things I found is it's hard to know if you're buying whole grain flour, if you're really buying whole grain flour. It has a meaning. I mean, the government does define it as having all parts of the wheat seed, the germ, the bran, and the endosperm. However, there's very little way to enforce that that's what's actually happened. And from what I've been able to learn, the mills don't like to deal with the germ because it tends to go bad quickly. It contains volatile oils like omega-3s that go rancid, that oxidize quickly. And it gums up their equipment, and they would rather just not deal with it. Plus, they can sell it to the pharmaceutical industry for good money. So it's a valuable byproduct. So as I understand it, whole grain is normally white flour that's had bran added back. Now, some mills claim to add the germ back as well. That's what they say, but they need to say that. And I don't know I don't know how often that's true. I can't say with certainty that they're not doing that, but there's good reason to doubt it. That letter that person wrote to Pillsbury that you shared with me said they were very frank, saying, no, our whole wheat flour is not whole grain, which means presumably they're leaving out the germ. So it's a very kind of muddy area, and it certainly needs the eye of a regulator or the eye of an investigative reporter to get to the bottom of it. And then there's the whole issue, of course, if you're buying bread that's labeled whole wheat, that often just means it's brown. Because you can even have that little stamp from the Whole Grains Council merely by having 51% of the flour be whole grain, but that whole grain flour may not really be totally whole grain. So you're diminishing the amount that you're getting. And that's a shame, because we are learning, as you suggested, we're learning a lot about the health benefits of whole grains, and that there is really good research. But there is strong evidence that the whole grain itself leads to improved health outcomes and lowered mortality from all causes. So there is good research about that. I mean, without question, we should all be eating more whole grains. The industry makes it very hard to do so, and the government really doesn't help very much by poorly regulating the category. The concern is with fiber, and if you look at a product like, Wonder Bread has whole grain bread now, or partially whole grain bread, and they're selling it on the basis of that whole grain equals fiber, and that there's lots of fiber in that product. Like, I forget how many grams, but 8 grams or 10 grams of fiber. Some of it from bran, but some of it from soy fiber, some of it from anything you could imagine, cellulose, whatever. They'll put all kinds of fiber in there. And I think that the average person does think, oh yeah, you eat whole grain to get more fiber. But that's only one of the benefits. Increasingly, we're learning that the reason that a high fiber diet is good may not be the fiber, but what comes with the fiber, which is things like the germ and the antioxidants and the various phytochemicals that you get out of specific kinds of fiber, parts of fiber, and the germ from these whole grains. David Jacobs did a great study a few years ago on the synergy of whole grains, and he showed how, you know, there are all these benefits we know that are in whole grain. This B vitamin, that B vitamin, fiber, omega-3s, antioxidants, you know, everything. He listed all 13 or 20 things we know are good from whole grains, whole grain wheat. And then he looked at people who get an equivalent amount of all those good nutrients versus people who are eating the actual whole grain itself. And there was a health benefit to the actual whole grain itself that exceeded by quite a bit the benefits of getting the parts of whole grain. And why should that be? Well, maybe there's a synergy between the parts. Maybe we haven't isolated all the benefits yet. There may be things there we don't see because our science doesn't allow us to see it quite yet. You know, like many things, a kernel of wheat may be more than the sum of its parts. It is a system, and things work together. Starches need to be in the company of B vitamins to be properly metabolized. You need these things together, and the beauty, the elegance of the design of a seed is it has all these things together in roughly, you know, the right proportions. Now, not to feed us, that's not why the seed exists, to feed a new plant. But all living things, you know, need certain things in common. And so, you know, it's very hard for us to think we can outsmart a well-designed seed. But that, of course, is what we try to do all the time. The idea that whole foods have a superiority is tied to Darwinian science, which is to say we evolved eating certain things. And our bodies are well adapted to eating those things. Mother's milk being the ultimate example, of course. It's the perfectly co-evolved food, in that you know, it's been selected. I mean, the mother would not give all this metabolic energy to this food if it didn't have an advantage for the baby, because there wouldn't be a survival advantage, right? So everything in mother's milk has a purpose. It is the ultimate whole food. And the scientific view is you can simulate that. Well, that's been a failure so far. And so the idea that you can reduce foods to their constituent parts and put those parts together and make a successful food, I don't know where that's been proven. But we do know that people eating whole foods that they've been eating for tens of thousands of years do pretty well on a whole range of whole foods.